I grew up in San Gabriel Valley, which is a suburb of in Los Angeles County. Pretty, pretty sheltered kind of suburban life, I would say. And the town I grew up in, West Covina, was a mix. I think it used to be like citrus groves and all white, and then more Asian and Latino folks and Filipino too as well started moving into the area. So I think now it's actually really diverse. And is like a lot of capital of like a lot of boba. There's a lot of boba in the San Gabriel Valley, a lot of good food, and I grew up there until I was 17 with my parents and my two sisters. And my dad was working when I was really young, was working actually for Aerojet, which is and he was working as an engineer. And he came over from Taiwan to basically do his graduate studies in the US. And then my mom came over as a student on a student visa to learn English. And her sister was already here, and so she started learning English and was doing kind of odd jobs, I think definitely, yeah. I would say grew up pretty kind of conservative, yeah, just buying into individualism and kind of that story of kind of the immigration, in some ways what a lot of immigrants believe about coming to America, and and because they had made it, quote unquote, my dad had a very stable job with a pension. My mom was a small business owner. She opened a video store, and then once Blockbuster and Netflix started happening, they sold it because it was going out of business. And then she opened up an eyeglass store. So she's always very entrepreneurial, and so that I think also contributed to their mindset, because she was a small business owner. Yeah.
When did you sort of develop your own social justice consciousness?
Yeah, it's how did I develop a consciousness in my family, actually? It's pretty interesting. I would say it's even growing up in a suburb and pretty sheltered, I experienced racism and saw racism and saw my parents, as immigrants, they had people yell at them and tell them you should be speak English better, and things like that. So it wasn't it wasn't I didn't see that, and experience racism. Nothing I think nothing I would say systemic to the point of I couldn't, there were certain things I couldn't do in life, but it just experienced it in the daily life, right? Because it just pervades everything. And I think feeling that and knowing it, and always just feeling yeah, there's something about the fact that my family's immigrant that engendered shame, actually, and growing up. And it wasn't until later on, and I took my first ethnic studies class in college, I was oh, there's a reason, there's a name for why I'm made to feel this way, and kind of understanding a little bit more the systems of why immigration happens, and then kind of race, class, and gender intersecting together. So it was definitely yeah, I would say that my politicization started in college, but probably didn't actually really, I didn't fully kind of commit to it, in a sense, until I started my first job and met some people who were actually doing activism and organizing in Oakland Chinatown. And that was kind of my first kind of understanding of a more broader social justice movement of beyond just terms like racism and sexism. It was oh, there's actually people who are still fighting to keep people in their homes and stop them from being evicted. And these were elderly Chinese immigrants, actually in this plaza. Yeah, it was really where I live now. I didn't understand what organizing was. People would throw around the word organizing, we gotta organize people. And I'm but what does that actually mean? It's and I was just people get so, I would see the other, these volunteer activists who were part of this group at the time called CJWP, and it was mostly Chinese, Taiwanese, younger people in their 20s who were volunteering to help organize the tenants who lived here who were getting evicted. And I remember they would just be it was so hard to get people to understand that they should stay and fight, and they should work together, and they should talk to their neighbors, And so I think at that point I was oh, organizing means something, it means something, I don't understand it, and but it's really important, because it was all about how to organize the tenants to not leave and not give up, right? From that point, I kind of made the connection around, you can have a lot of good data and information, and you can have all the research you want that shows like, hey, you know, elderly people, when they're forced to move very late in their life, it actually has really bad consequences for them health-wise. Like, it's very hard for them to, you know, emotionally, physically, psychologically, to uproot their lives. But you can know all this, and you can present all this data to all the elected officials and, you know, the people who are decision makers, and it doesn't make a difference unless folks are organized, you know, unless people actually like are building power. And that's the only way to kind of force things to change a different way. And so that was when it first kind of clicked around, like, oh, what's the importance of actually grassroots organizing, and why is it that we need to like how do you build power in a community? It actually takes like people coming together and uniting and working together. So after I lived in China for a year and a half, and I was studying Mandarin and learning Chinese and reconnecting with my family there, I interviewed for a youth organizer position at CPA, working with high school students, and I got the job. And so in 2008, I went back to the Bay Area and just started working at CPA as a youth organizer. And you know, I was there for 10 years, from youth organizing to then working on, you know, I started doing communications work for our campaigns. I was doing some of our alliance building with, you know, different issues in the city, and then from there kind of went into the electoral work and became the political director my last few years at CPA. And so, you know, I always really appreciate that about CPA and like organizations that can allow someone to grow. You know, I think like a lot of times our organizations are really small, these grassroots nonprofits, and sometimes it's like, so how do we develop ourselves too? And I always appreciate that about that. Working at CPA, I was able to like learn a lot of new things, and like, you know, it's not like our work is like you just do whatever you want. It's like, yeah, there's things I didn't like to do and there's things I like to do, and I feel like part of it is like doing the things I was interested in exploring and learning more about. There was a lot of room for that at CPA, and so and that's how I eventually got into the electoral organizing work, which at first I was not, I wasn't really clear, like what's the strategy, what's the purpose, you know, because sometimes electoral work can feel very short-sighted and short-term, while it's also very clearly like benefiting there's some real impacts too about, you know, if we can pass this measure to have, you know, to tax millionaires in California, that means actually we're gonna have lower tuition for our students, and like that's a direct impact, you know. So I think over the years I just have learned that things are not so black and white, you know, like we actually need a lot of strategies to win, from electoral organizing to policy to service work to organizing, and that's all needed. You know, there's not one thing, you know. And I think right now it feels, because of our current political environment, with Trump as our president, and yeah, just I feel like we're in a state of actually crisis, that like to me the electoral work is actually really important right now, because we've seen exactly the effects of when we don't take it seriously, what can happen, you know, and it has a huge impact on our communities. So I think there's just, you know, and now currently as the director of San Francisco Rising, which is a multiracial electoral alliance, I just feel like, yes, we need to be doing this, and we need to bring more people to do this, and it's critical that we actually intervene in the electoral system.